Hi, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of Brave Briefings, where brave men and women come and share either their stories or tips on living safe and peacefully. A life devoid of harassment and toxic masculinity and devoid of sexual and gender based violence. So, are you brave? Hi, I am Lois, your friend for forgiveness from walking without skin. And today I have another brave woman with me, Deb Morgan. Hi, Deb.
Hi, Lois. Pleased to be here.
I'm so grateful that you are. Thank you for joining us. Deb, tell our viewers a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Deb Morgan and I'm known as the real relationships expert. But I wasn't always an expert in relationships. I've got a background of domestic abuse. My first husband was physically and sexually abusive. In fact, he beat me up for the first time on our wedding night with the words, "You're mine now. I can do what I like with you." I'd been dating him from the age of 14. We married when I was 20. At no point in those years had he ever laid a finger on me. He'd actually treated me like an absolute princess. That all changed the moment we got married. From that relationship, I left him after about 2 years because there's that fear of leaving them. Will they find me? Will they follow me? Etc. etc. But I did leave him and I had a couple of short lived relationships. And then I met my second husband. And the irony that I ended up marrying my kickboxing instructor after being in an abusive relationship wasn't lost on me. But what I hadn't realized was that he was to become my next abuser. And I was entering into a psychologically abusive marriage. And I stayed in that marriage for 5 years. We were together in total for about 7 years. We had a child in the marriage who is now 16. And it was a classic case of I hadn't actually realized I was being abused. And when you look at everything I had the beautiful house in a sought after location. I had a successful business. I drove a nice car. I had a fantastic wardrobe. All of the trappings of success and a perfect life were there. And my husband was the archetypal tall, dark, and handsome. So, on the face of it, we looked like we had the perfect relationship. But I was desperately unhappy and I didn't know why. It was only after I left him that I really understood what psychological abuse was and that that's what had been going on in my marriage. And that's why I had felt so unhappy and so uncomfortable. As a part of that experience, he had led me to believe that I was incapable of being a mum and looking after our child. And so when I left him, I left my son, who was then 3 years old, with him because I truly didn't believe I was capable of looking after my son on my own. Although the last thing I wanted to do was to leave him. When I got myself on my feet and went back to him to say, "I'm ready now, I've got somewhere to live, our son can come and live with me," he turned around and said, "He'll live with you over my dead body." And that started me on a 10-year legal battle to gain residency of my son and to actually prove that I was fit to be his mum and his primary carer. So not only was I then having to battle against my ex husband, I was battling against the authorities and against social services and all of the associations that are there that are meant to help you. At one point, a judge in one of the court hearings turned round and said to me, "You can't possibly be the victim of abuse because you're a confident and eloquent witness." And that was soul destroying because it had taken every ounce of strength I had left to stand there in that court that day and face my ex husband. But I left him and continued to fight for my son. And I'm pleased to say that it does have a happy ending. My son came to live with me 4 years ago when he was 12 years old. So it worked out in the end. But after leaving my ex husband, all wasn't well. We had, well, I had started a business. He had come and worked alongside me in that business. And what I didn't realize until I left was that he had been quietly sabotaging it from within, because he felt emasculated by my success and didn't like the fact that I was more successful than he was. So when I left him, my business became insolvent. I went through personal bankruptcy as well as all of that other stuff going on in the background. I reached a stage where I really thought life wasn't worth living and tried to take my own life. However, the night that I decided I was going to do that, that I lifted the pills to my mouth and the bottle, I tilted my head back and I caught sight of a photograph of my son on my bookcase. And I knew that I had to do whatever it would take to be there for my son when he was 14 years old, so that I could prove to him that mummy didn't kill herself because she didn't love him. Mummy was here because she loved him so much she wanted to be around for him, because he was being told that mummy had left him because she didn't want him or didn't love him, which was the furthest away from the truth as it was possible to be. And that night I made a massive, massive decision, a life-changing decision. I had nothing else left. I had no business. I couldn't get a job. I was facing bankruptcy for the second time. And so I looked at the one thing I had left, and I became an independent escort and entered the sex industry as a sex worker. Now, I'm very aware that that made me a statistic. After all, I had a background of abuse, and I know from the research I've done that the majority of sex workers, although they are in the industry through choice, the majority of them have a background of abuse. So I was ticking so many boxes in terms of being a victim of abuse. However, what the sex industry did for me was open my eyes. It led me to understand that there were men out there who would treat me properly, even though I was in this job that was deemed not acceptable by society. And in the time I worked in that industry, I had so many of my preconceptions shattered and had so many questions that went unanswered that it led me on the path to what I do now. And I started to study for a psychology degree on the Open University. And that started me on the right path, but I still wasn't out of the woods, so to speak. While I was working in that industry, in a classic pretty woman moment, I met somebody who I fell in love with. He was a client, he fell in love with me, I fell in love with him. It was absolutely pretty woman. And I'm forever grateful that through meeting him, I was able to leave the industry. But what I hadn't realized was that I was leaving the sex industry and entering my third abusive relationship. This time it was economically abusive. So because I'd been through bankruptcy, because I'd had a failed business, because I'd been in the sex industry, he decided he was going to give me an allowance every month, which sounds wonderful. I mean, who wouldn't, on the face of it, want to be a kept woman? But what happened was, whilst I could spend the money on anything I wanted to, and there were no quibbles, no questions about that, I had to account for every single penny I was spending. So even though very early on in that relationship, I knew it wasn't right, I knew I wasn't happy, I knew I had used that relationship to escape the sex industry, I knew I was suffocating the relationship. I couldn't get out of it because I wasn't able to squirrel any money away to put on a deposit on a flat, for example. So I felt stuck. But slowly, I started to rebuild my own life. I'd gone from what I thought were the worst days of my life through the abuse. I'd gone from being in the sex industry and having my eyes opened and receiving an education in more ways than one, to a place where all of a sudden I was going back down. Although, again, I had a fantastic lifestyle. He was in a very well-paid job. He could afford to give me an allowance every month. I was desperately unhappy. And I was plunged into a deep, deep depression where I ended up almost feral. I lived on my kitchen floor for at least 3 weeks at one stage, not showering, not washing my hair, not brushing my teeth, not changing my clothes, until he walked home one day and said, "Deb, you really do need to have a bath or have a shower because you stink." And that was the wake-up call I needed, because that flicked a switch inside me where I knew that I wasn't going to end up like this. I wasn't going to end up this unhappy, this wretched. But the only person that could make a change was me. And so I started to work on myself very, very slowly, tiny, tiny steps on a day by day basis, which gradually got me back to the stage where I felt I could start to study again, where I felt that I could go outside again, that I could hold my head up high. And I left him. I started to pursue my own dreams, my own passions, which were the theatre. And I got cast in a touring production, which took me to the southwest of England, which is where I now live. And I knew the day I got cast in that production that it was going to change my life, but I had no idea how. And what it did was lead me back into the path of a man I had dated between husbands one and two, who I had met and I had known he was the love of my life. But we went our separate ways. He went to university as a mature student. I went to live and work in a different city. And it was the days before mobile phones. So maintaining a long distance relationship wasn't as easy then as it is now. And we just drifted apart. There was no big fallout, nothing. But I always knew he was the love of my life. And for a long time, I said, I'm going to end up with him one day. No idea where, when, or how, but we will end up together. And I know I will live out my days with him. To the point that friends thought there was something psychologically wrong with me, wanted me to go and see a therapist because it was an obsession, it wasn't normal. But I always had that belief we would end up together. And he actually walked into the theatre to book tickets for a production and recognized my face on the poster of the production I was in. Managed to track me down through the theatre staff and the production director. And we got in touch, we had a coffee and realized that all those old feelings were there. And 3 weeks later, I moved lock, stock, and barrel in with him in his bachelor pad in the southwest of England. Now, that was 8 years ago. 8 years down the line, we're now very, very happy. I share his name. We're not married, but I share his name. We've got a house together. My son lives with us. And I've learned what it is to be in a truly unconditional relationship that's strong, healthy, and robust. So, through all of the studying I have done, through all of the experience I've had, through working with my own coaches, I recognized and learned that what I'm an expert in is relationships. And in the help I give to my clients, I draw upon all of that. I draw upon my experience, I draw upon my training, and I work with my clients through what they're going through. And I draw upon that very unique insight I have into the male psyche that I could never have had if I hadn't worked in the sex industry. So that's a little bit about me, a little bit about what I do and why I do what I do. But my mission is to reduce the prevalence of domestic abuse around the world, because domestic abuse is responsible for shattering so many lives. And I really believe that there's no need for it, not at the prevalence that we see it now.
Wow, thank you for sharing your story so vulnerably. Wow, what a story, and well done for getting to where you are today. That's wonderful. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you.
So we could spend 2 hours now. You can give us all the tips, but what is one tip you can give us to help us stop this domestic and gender-based violence?
Well, Lois, you asked me to give you a tip based on one of the letters in Brave. And the biggest lesson, the biggest tip I can share comes under R, and that's R for respect. Because what I learned through all of my experience, the absolute underlying value is respect, respect for self and respect for others. But that was truly brought home when I worked in the sex industry, because I was working with professional men who had respect for me. They respected my boundaries. They respected when I said no. They respected that I was providing a service. They respected that they couldn't just turn up on the doorstep. They respected what I was saying. But more interestingly, is that I learned that when they came to see me, it actually wasn't about the sex. It was about them wanting somebody to talk to and communicate with and respect them for just being a man, for not being the boss, not being the husband, the father, the provider. They just wanted somebody to talk to on a completely equal non-judgmental level. And I realized over the years that it was my lack of self-respect that had led me to marry men who were going to treat me badly. But it was their lack of self-respect that made them treat me in the way that they treated me. They didn't have respect for me, but that's because of what they had learned from their backgrounds. It was a learned behavior for the most part. And some men will gladly change and acknowledge that they need to change, and they will learn what they need to learn to enable them to have respect for themselves and respect for others. Some men will forever go down the path believing that they are right, it's not them that needs to change, it's everybody that needs to change, as in the case of my second husband. But for me, it all boils down to respect. And when we learn to respect ourselves, then we respect other people. And one of the biggest indications we have of respect or lack of respect, as far as I'm concerned, is when you go to the supermarket or the store. I'm sure, Lois, like me, you've been to your local store and you have heard parents effing and blinding at their children across the store. And the children are effing and blinding back. And it breaks my heart. And I ask myself, where is the respect in that relationship? Because the parents certainly have no respect for their children. But what the parents are doing is showing the children how to treat other people. And the children are therefore treating the parents in the way they are being treated, because that's how they believe, that's how they learn we should treat others. And unless that is broken, then that perpetuates and the cycle continues through generation after generation after generation. And at some point, that aggressive language, that aggressive tone, the bad language turns into physical aggression. And if that is how that family communicates, then that message perpetuates through the generations as well. So by learning to have respect for one another, talk to each other as we wish to be talked to, spoken to, behave to each other as we want others to behave towards us, then gradually over time, we build up respect. We are able to model behavior that actually helps future generations.
Wow. That is so insightful, and it's so interesting because we always think of respect as opening car doors and treating people in that way, but it starts with self-respect, and it starts with children. The swearing and the shouting and at the kids is not respectful at all. So
Yeah,
yes, we need to start right in those early ages when they're still toddlers.
exactly.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that about respect. Guys, there's so much. I think we need to have another session, Deb. I'm sure
I'd love to.
there's a lot more you could share with us. So thank you very much for that. Respect, it is so important. So, viewers out there, you too can be brave. You too can help us stop this scourge, this silent pandemic, all this unnecessary violence. So you can contact Deb. She knows a lot. She can share a lot. We'll put her detail below, or you can contact me at Walking Without Skin. So please do join us. Be bold, be brave, and fly free. Thank you very much for joining us, Deb. Thank you, viewers. Join us again tomorrow for another edition of Brave Briefings. Bye.
Goodbye.